and Infrastructure Committee. Congressman, thank you so much. Given your assignments, you're the perfect person to talk about this. And it does strike me in thinking about this interview, as I understand it, the way we got our interstate highway system was actually because of the military, because Dwight David Eisenhower, when he was a general, was a logistics person. When we got to be president, he said, we need it for military purposes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, you know, the infrastructure bill that's being held up in the House that left the Senate in a very bipartisan manner, it's just confounding to me. And what they're doing is both sides are conflating infrastructure, which is a $1.2 trillion bill, which would help with roads and bridges and ports, which I think we need to talk more about, and all the other critical infrastructure, the hard infrastructure dollars. That's $1.2 trillion, and it's largely paid for already. And they think in the long term would more than pay for itself. You got to balance that with a $3.5 trillion monstrosity, which is a social expansion program, which some people think is infrastructure as well. It's not. And so the two are very different, and the infrastructure bill should go on its own. But if you really want to look at a component of the infrastructure bill that's really important to what we're doing right now, it's there's a lot of money in that infrastructure package for ports and expanding ports and making ports more business friendly. And look what's going on in LA right now. That's a great example of how infrastructure and supply chain are going hand in glove.
Well, I referred to infrastructure going back to the 40s and the 50s when we had a very different situation. What is infrastructure related to national security today? I don't think as much about having big trucks cart around tanks on our roads. It's other sorts of needs for national security.
Well, think about national security. Right now, the big issue is supply chain. People see it right now when they're going into stores. They have shortages, and that's an inconvenience. But that's just a microcosm of the real national security implications. And I think they kind of reared their ugly head during the pandemic when you saw that we didn't even have personal protective equipment in the United States. And when I was growing up in Syracuse, New York, Bristol-Myers created 60 to 70% of the nation's penicillin in Syracuse. And now we don't have any penicillin being produced in the United States, or very little. And that is a supply chain issue. That's a national security issue. Here's another one, chip manufacturing. We've lost a lot of our chip manufacturing because it's so expensive to do business in the United States. And so in 2017, when we cut taxes for businesses, it started that onshoring of businesses that had gone overseas. And now this administration wants to go back to the time where they're going to increase taxes, which is going to further impact our supply chain. There's a bill in Congress right now. It passed the Senate in a bipartisan manner called the CHIPS Act. And every day that waits in the House to get passed is another day that our supply chain is in dire straits, because the CHIPS Act will allow a lot more chip manufacturers to come back to the United States. And right now, with China rattling their saber in Taiwan, they go into Taiwan, and if they take over China, they will control 8% of the chip manufacturing in the world. That is national security, and that is also supply chain, and that's just another example.
Let me talk about one aspect of supply chain, if I may. We've talked to Pete Buttigieg, for example, the Secretary of Transportation, and it's clear that it's not just physical bricks and mortar and steel. It's also people, because when you talk about the ports, as you did, you can get those containers off those ships, but then you got to get them to where they need to go, and that requires truckers, and we've got a real deficiency in truck drivers.
Right, so that's why when the president the other day made a big deal out of saying that he's getting the port in Los Angeles to go work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, well, that's all well and good. That's just one link in the supply chain, the whole supply chain, if you will. The truckers are another one, coordinating better with the shipping companies, working better with companies internationally to make sure we're getting products in a timely manner. All that factors in, and there, so it's really window dressing to say you're going to get the ports work 24/7. Where are the drivers? Where is the efficiencies that you need at that port to get things on the road? And from my understanding, they haven't talked a lot with the shipping companies. They haven't talked a lot with the groups like the Teamsters that are going to be driving the trucks away from the port. And to me, that's all part of it. And this administration seems to be constantly playing catch up when it comes to crises, and this is just another one, supply chain crises.
So when you talk with the administration, when you talk with the White House, do they get it, to put it simply? I mean, are they engaged on this subject of infrastructure as a matter of national security?
I don't think so, and I don't think so, because they wouldn't be seeking to raise taxes if that was the case. You can't raise taxes and say you're tuned into supply chain, because that is just going to force more companies out of our area. I mean, we need to not only bring business back to us in the United States, we also need to do what we call nearshore and help develop businesses in Central America, for example, where that would have the added benefit of keeping people from rushing across our border because there's economic opportunity. But it's also a supply chain issue that's much easier to overcome because they're in our hemisphere and they're in our backyard, and we can work with them easier to get goods to the U.S. Those are the types of things we got to be thinking about, and it doesn't seem that they're thinking about them. And I introduced a bill that passed the House. It's called critical domains legislation. And what it would do is force Homeland Security to every year issue a report on what are the critical domains in the country and where are shortages from a supply chain standpoint, and what do we need to emphasize going forward from a policy standpoint. We don't seem to have that centralized thinking right now. And if you think that just because you have bare store shelves and you fix the bare store shelves for the Christmas season, you're fixing the supply chain issue, you're just not paying attention to the bigger picture.
This is a really important point, just finally here, Congressman, because as you suggest, when you talk about nearshoring, it's not just a matter of making it in the United States, it's also making sure, we saw that with respect to personal protective equipment, where so much of it was made in China. We were surprised about that, and that's not necessarily the smartest move. Can you redirect trade so we are getting the things we need from countries that we think are more likely to be aligned with us?
Absolutely. There's a thing called the Quad, for example. The Quad is, if I remember correctly, Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. And they've developed kind of this an alliance where they're reliable trade partners for the long term. You can't rely on China for the long term. And and China will always look out for China's interests and China's interests only. And we've got to incentivize businesses to maybe develop supply chain, not just in China, but maybe outside of China, in places like India and Japan and the United States and Australia, and try and get those countries and us together to have better trade so we don't have these supply chain issues. When we start relying on, we have such an over-reliance on the cheap labor in China, we turn a blind eye to what they're doing from a human rights standpoint with the Uyghurs, for example, or the saber rattling they constantly do, or what they just did with human rights in Hong Kong. Right. And we just turn a blind eye just so our businesses can make a buck. We're really doing ourselves a disservice in the United States. We've really got to start thinking long term. And so again, I can't emphasize enough, the president saying he's going to get the people in the port of Los Angeles to work 24 hours is completely myopic.
Congressman, a really valuable perspective. Thank you for sharing it with us. That's Congressman John Katko, Republican of the state of New York. Coming up, the SEC on the cusp of approving Bitcoin futures ETFs. We're going to discuss that in our Stock of the